Vermont Chamber's virtual policy series, which we're holding on Monday afternoons. We're expecting about 180 people who have registered today. We're hoping that the sunny afternoon hasn't kept too many people away. It looks like we're just getting over that 100 person mark right now. We'll be with you shortly. Okay, that's good. I think I'm going to get started. Welcome. I'm Betsy Bishop, the president of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we continue our virtual policy series, which we are holding every Monday afternoon through March. We are bringing together government and business leaders to get your questions answered, provide access to key Vermont leaders, and bring you up to speed on important policy. Special thanks to our series sponsors, AT&T, Cigna, and Noel Johnson. We are so glad to have these sponsors help us put on this kind of great programming across the state. During registration, we collected your questions and we will get to those. We'll hopefully get to all of them, but I also encourage you to use the chat, the sidebar, and encourage you to put your questions there. When you do, please click the drop-down menu to all attendees and panelists so that everybody can see your questions. And then that way we can have a pretty vibrant chat as well as a chat with our guests. Advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion is a priority for many organizations, including the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. Our board meets quarterly and has begun working on DEI issues through a task force that initially started with the mission to diversify our board. The mission quickly broadened to include diversifying our membership and partnering with other organizations to help BIPOC businesses thrive in Vermont. We are developing programming to support and promote BIPOC businesses and other businesses in efforts to address DEI initiatives in their own companies. We'll be gathering input through an outreach process to ensure that we meet the needs of these businesses. If any members on this call would like to be involved in this work, please email our Membership Engagement Director, Sophia Yeager. We'll put her email address in the chat. The legislature has also prioritized this work, and today we welcome Representative Hal Colston and Senator Keisha Ram. Senator Ram was elected to the Senate in 2020. She represents Chittenden County. She previously served in the Vermont House of Representatives and was the first person of color in history to represent Burlington. Senator Ram serves on the Senate Committee on Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs, as well as the Government Operations Committee. Representative Colston has served in the House of Representatives since 2019, representing Winooski. He also is a Winooski City Councilor. He serves on the House Committee on Government Operations. So thank you both for being here today. And I think what we'll do is we'll get started with your priorities. Representative Colston, if you'd like to tip this off, you noted a focus on why and how a Vermont Truth and Reconciliation Commission will be benefit to all Vermonters as we seek a more perfect union. Can you highlight some of the work this commission will ideally accomplish and other priorities you might have in this area?
Sure. Thank you so much, Betsy, for inviting me to this panel. What I like to do is share with you actually the conclusion of a research report from a team of UVM students. And as we were first looking into the bill to stand up a Truth and Reconciliation Development Task Force, we had a research paper conducted to give us a better sense of what's out there in terms of processes in our country as well as around the world. So I just want to share with you their conclusion, which I think really gives a lot more depth to what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission does. Several governments have created Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to address historic oppressions and harms that affected special racial and cultural groups. These commissions focus on governments and their relationship with a segment of their population. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is designed to address the specific contexts and histories of each jurisdiction and its residents. An effective Truth and Reconciliation Commission provides space for victims to provide testimony, reconnects governments with the previously ostracized population, and restores trust in government by those who have been physically or emotionally harmed by that government's policies or actions. The most successful Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are individualized, comprehensive, and temporary. Some of these commissions also provide frameworks for future reparation or study. So I see this as a foundational step for Vermonters to begin embracing the idea of dismantling systemic racism or reparations for those who have been harmed by systemic racism. And having this kind of process where all Vermonters can come together and share their harm by our systems of oppression, I think is a beginning process for us to heal as a state of those broken relationships and to understand how do we repair those broken relationships. So I see this approach as foundational for leading us down the path of becoming an anti-racist government. I would also like to add, there's been some great work going on in the legislature through the Social Equity Caucus. As a matter of fact, Senator Rahm is a co-chair along with Representative Christie. And this new affinity group has brought together about 75 legislators, including representatives and senators, along with more than 75 community members from all around the state who are doing advocacy work, community organizing work around achieving racial and social equity. So the SEC has a mission, which is to focus deliberately on improving outcomes for marginalized peoples and create a vehicle for Vermonters to access the representation, leadership, and community. It is not enough to get rid of institutionalized inequality. We aim to institutionalize equity and inclusivity. So the SEC has been really formidable, I believe, in helping us as legislators really have a clearer focus on some of the bills that we need to be addressing to achieve racial and social equity. The SEC was very instrumental last summer when we were looking at a number of bills to deal with police reform in terms of mitigating the harms that have been done to people of color in our state. And the SEC helped to organize 3 statewide hearings that brought in new voices into the conversation about how do we achieve social and racial equity. It was from that process that we realized there were a lot of new voices that had come to the table to express their concerns and to offer their ideas around achieving social equity. And we then stood up a smaller group of 14 Vermonters who came together with a purpose of making policy recommendations for legislators as we do our work and do it through the lens of social and racial equity. There were 6 lawmakers who joined this group, this working group. I co-chaired it with a community member, and we put together a pretty thorough report making policy recommendations for legislators as we do our work to achieve social and racial equity. This effort is barely 2 years old, and I'm really excited the direction that we've taken through the Social Equity Caucus, and as we continue to provide whatever support we can to our fellow legislators as they're moving through legislation of this kind, and to be an asset in ways for helping them reach out to different and new voices to have a more thought through process to make sure we're trying to get it right as we do this important legislation. And lastly, it's exciting to know that our House leadership has taken it upon herself to begin to do this kind of work with committee chairs, the chairs and vice chairs of all the House committees. And that will begin shortly as we begin to help to shape that culture and eventually have opportunities for actual committee persons to participate in the diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops. So we're moving down that path. It's an exciting time to be in the legislature, and I believe we're going to really accomplish some great work as we try to make our state one that is anti-racist throughout its government. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. You've tipped off a couple of really sort of big topics that hopefully we can delve into as we go through this conversation. Right now, I'm going to just turn my attention to Senator Rahm. Welcome. You noted that a priority for this discussion should be what the business community can do to retain and support BIPOC staff and leaders, and maybe why they should. Perhaps you want to share your thoughts about that and other priorities that you have.
Well, sure, absolutely. And let me start by saying, thank you for having this conversation. Thank you to everyone who's joining. It is a big deal that you're taking time out of your day to have this conversation. And, I can't see most people, but I'm going to trust that if I say some things that make you uncomfortable, you acknowledge and can acknowledge that that's because I'm trying to offer you something that's valuable, because if we just sort of sat here and said, we're on a great path and I'm the one woman of color in the legislature and that's great, then, I would not be helping you. There would be no reason for me to be here today. So I would start by saying that. And, as Representative Colston, who I really respect and admire, talked about, there's a need for some truth before we can have reconciliation. And, that's something that's been uncomfortable in Vermont that we need to face. I would start also by saying, I grew up for folks who haven't heard this before, my Indian immigrant father and my Jewish American mother ran an Irish pub in Los Angeles, and that's where I was raised. And, my father faced every kind of barrier imaginable for having an accent as an immigrant business owner. His name was Mukul, but he always went by Mike, so that there was, no effort to pronounce his name, which is coming up a lot in the aftermath of the shooting of mostly Asian American women in Atlanta. There's a lot of pain that comes along with having an immigrant business, even though it is the American dream. It is, something that is in a lot of our blood to try and strive for. So having said all that, I was just on a call earlier today. I'm new to the board of the Office of Engagement through UVM that some of you may be engaging with as well. And the question was, what can we do to help ensure the success of BIPOC Vermonters, Black, Indigenous, and people of color identifying Vermonters? And my question back was, what can white business owners and leaders do to get out of the way of BIPOC business owners and those who want to find a place here? And I know that might make some uncomfortable, but also resonate with some of you as saying, how can government get out of my way? I'm not asking for anything. I'm asking to just, have a piece of the pie and be able to create jobs and, sort of set down my roots here. That's what a lot of people of color are asking for as well. And as folks may know, 90% of the population growth in the state over the last decade or so has been the growth of BIPOC Vermonters, resettled refugees, people coming from other parts of the country, our higher ed institutions and major employers attracting them here. But the issue is often that they don't stay. And they follow in a long historic line of people of color who felt pushed away from the state of Vermont. So the question is not why don't they come here, but why don't they stay? Why don't they feel welcome here when they get here? And so we can ask, why did a group of people try to push Alexander Twilight's schoolhouse off its foundation? Why was this a stop on the Underground Railroad, but people continued on and didn't stay here? Why did the Buffalo Soldiers double the Black population of Vermont in the turn of the century, but not feel welcome and leave? Why did, we try to erase Abenaki people from the face of the earth with the eugenics movement? And those answers to those questions, that truth that comes before the reconciliation, will also answer a lot about how do we keep and retain, people of color as employees and new business owners in the state as well. Because I can tell you, you have a lot of new Americans who have, who come with far less preconceived notions of, what historic wrongs that need to be righted. But I still hear from them all the time, I feel really constrained here. I don't want to, beg for the opportunity to serve Indian meals in this, senior center when my family has opened a Bhutanese Nepali senior center in Pennsylvania, and I could just go be part of that. And we don't have to sort of fit into an existing culture in a way that's very constraining for us. So, I also would say, in closing, people may have seen my piece in my op-ed in Vermont Digger recently that really took Mayor Weinberger to task. And, I will tell you that people of color are not just looking for you to hire Black and Indigenous and people of color identifying folks. They're asking you to support them and back them up and trust their leadership as well. And so, that's where that op-ed came from. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about it. But it is not enough to say we need to populate our organization with more Black and brown faces. Those people need to feel supported when they get there.
Some really good points that will all make us think. And I think you tipped off your comments by saying, if I say things to make you uncomfortable. And I think that's sort of a big point here that I think many of us are learning. It is okay to be uncomfortable, and it is okay to address that and as we go forward. So, I think many of us are on a learning journey, and I think we have, over 180 people registered for today's discussion. And I think those are folks, just some of which are eager for this journey and how to embrace. And I think one of the things that you just brought up, Senator Rahm, is the notion of how do we help people feel welcome here. We at the Vermont Chamber have been spending a lot of energy thinking about how do we get people here? How do we encourage people to come? And we have seen from that when people do move here from away, that there is this issue, and not, frankly, not only just people of color, sort of that Vermontism that we think about, are you from here? So many of us are not from here, and we need to embrace that. And so, thinking about how to help people want to stay, I would be curious about what both of you are thinking, if there are a couple of things that you could suggest, that what do you see that's working in that place that's maybe working well, and maybe something well-meaning people are doing that isn't working?
Well, I would approach that question and frame it, why are people not staying? What is it that drives people away? And I think it always comes back to us in a personal way. And if we're unaware of our implicit biases, and we all have them, and we're not able to manage them, then we have the same behavior over and over again that may push people away. I think the key to making anyone want to feel connected and to make this place their home is all about relationships. And how can we be in relationship with one another? The Public Religion Research Institute did a study a few years back. They're based in DC, and they did a national study, and they came up with a figure of 75% white people do not have a friend of color. 75%. So that's our reality. So how do we change that? So we have to develop these meaningful relationships. We got to build trust across differences, and it's at that point where people in the dominant culture are on their own journey with this work and can articulate how they're oppressed by this system of oppression. Then we're working together as equals in real solidarity, and we can do great work together. But it's going to take work of the dominant culture to question, how did we come to this point? And what am I missing in understanding my own history of how we got here? And then begin to understand the policies that we have been putting in place for decades and decades and decades that creates this divide. So it calls on internal work, doing the self-reflection, looking in the mirror and being honest and open and willing to learn and be challenged, and hopefully shift our being and shift our attitude to be an open and appreciative state where we're learning and growing as our state evolves and changes, because it's not the old Vermont that was in place 100 years ago, 150 years ago. We're changing today.
And I think we're so thankful for so many changes. And I think we have to continue that in this realm as well. Senator Rahm, did you want to address that welcoming question?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to thank Amy Cunningham, who's been really helpful in the chat on a number of fronts. Yes. Amy, I will work with Betsy to get some of those reports, the Social Equity Caucus Working Group report and the 2 reports of the Racial Equity Task Force that Susanna Davis put together. Those are publicly available, but not always easy to find. So we'll get folks that. And Amy, thank you for putting my other column that was quite popular from January in the chat as well. I did not expect to have almost 1,000 shares just on Facebook's little metrics on that website alone for that piece. But it clearly struck a chord with people. And, the real thrust of that article, though I do hope you read it, it's short, is that, often what a lot of white people do is get to the stage of, saying we need more diversity, so how do we build that diversity in? And then people of color get there and have very different opinions and perspectives and, want to say, hey, like, I don't know if you just wanted someone with a different complexion here, but we have lots of different views on how to arrive at solutions as well. And it's, what was the checkbox, that we sort of filled. And we can tell, we can sort of smell that blood in the water that, people weren't really sure what they were doing when they invited us onto a board or into a conversation. So I would say there's, to get past that, there's probably 3 things that I didn't put in the article. This could be a whole nother op-ed. I'm kind of on fire with these, but, there's 3 things that I really encourage people to think about. And that's curiosity, gratitude, and compensation. So if you're inviting BIPOC folks into, it could be one person, it could be a friend, it could be someone you don't know that well, or it could be a conversation like this. When we walk away, one of the important pieces is that curiosity. Are you asking questions to really learn the information or to argue? Because we just don't have time for that. And so my good friend Tabitha Moore, who started the Rutland NAACP, will often say, are you asking me because you don't understand or because you don't agree? And I would really encourage people to ask themselves that before they ask a person of color that question, because it's too exhausting for us. It's just too exhausting to argue with people when we think we're helping you answer a question. 2, with that gratitude piece, as I kind of alluded to in the beginning of my remarks, if we tell you something difficult, it's because we trust you can hear it. You should consider it a compliment and be grateful that someone shared something, so personal. So when, a BIPOC individual in Vermont comes to you and says, I'm really struggling here. I'm really struggling in the workplace or in this community or in this committee or just in Vermont, the more that you can say, wow, thank you for telling me that before you say anything else, because usually what happens is a kind of like, really, are you sure? Are you sure they meant it that way? And then we're like, okay, that person, I can't really trust that I could just vent to them, and share this information. And I always am, nervous when I bring up compensation because I don't mean it right now. Representative Colston and I, we're doing all right. You know, we're fine. But, you know, if you say, I just want to pick your brain to a person of color, just know you're probably like the 20th person who said that to them this week. And I'm like, y'all at least have to buy me like a snack or something, you know, if not donate to an organization that we care about or something, because, you know, Hal and I certainly signed up for that in many ways, but there are a lot of people who have not. And in fact, there's now the assumption that if someone does equity work, say they work for a municipality or a school district doing equity work, that their workplace supports them going to do this other work and give advice to other organizations. That's not necessarily true. It's not like they just get to be the equity fairy in the state. You know, they're often foregoing serious responsibility that they have or taking their own personal time to come talk with folks. So I'm not saying that to sort of cry my own river or anything. I'm just saying that because I have a lot of friends and colleagues who simply cannot keep doing this and end up looking like the ones to kind of be sour in the conversation when they're just getting to the point where they can't keep doing this for free. And the more you think about, am I the 8th person today to ask them to do this? And what can I do to really help them feel a little bit more like I value their time? That would be a really helpful way to engage.
Yeah, and so that's something that we have been discussing here, being a business organization, right? We want people to have their own businesses, whether that's one person or multi-person. And there seems to be some, I think I reached out to Representative Colston and said, is there a list somewhere of people who we can hire to help us do this work? We're not looking for just, you know, a speaker who can, and I think Hal, you said something to me like, a list would be a great idea. There's lists, but so we're helping do that so that we can share that list with businesses who are asking us, I need somebody to help me through our DEI journey at my little business or my big business. Who? So we're helping do that. We're doing some outreach on that. But, you know, you brought up Tabitha Moore, and if I just had the opportunity last week to watch Kia Morris's former representative, her new show, Lines of Color. And if you folks haven't seen that, it is super powerful. And it is a conversation between Kia and Tabitha Moore. And they talk about this subject a little bit too, about how when it was pretty powerful to me, when you invite a person of color to the table, and you say, we want you at the table, you have to actually not just want them and check it off the list, that you have to then with that take their advice, their input, their perspective. Both of these women were really powerful in this show, and were sort of telling those of us who are wanting to engage in this, you know, you just can't say it, you have to do it. So I hear that in both of you, and I appreciate that. I'm gonna try to move, the chat is active with people's resources, and that just so everybody on the call knows, what we do is we send out this recording, and then we also post in the same place all the resources that we have gathered with this. So all of those things, we will make sure that you have the op-eds, the reports, these types of things for absolutely. You know, one of the things I thought we could do is we've got a question about data, and I guess we've been starting to hear and learn about where this data is collected. You know, and it's probably no surprise that I come at this with sort of a business perspective. How do we help BIPOC businesses? How do we help people of color to start businesses? Where can we lend our support in something that we have expertise in? And then where can we learn to have expertise to help others? The Vermont Futures Project has launched a dashboard of racial diversity and equity sets. We'll put that in the chat as well. And I think there's some interesting information about the number of businesses in Vermont that are qualified as BIPOC. I think there's been some conversations lately of how is this gathered, and are those great stats? It's what we have. I think it can be perfected. But we also have a question from Willie Docto of the Moose Meadow Lodge, who asks, how can the state collect better data on minority-owned businesses? Could that be part of something that the Secretary of State does when they collect that info, perhaps as part of the business registration process? Is that anything that either of you two have talked about or have something to add there?
Yes, on the House side, we put together H96, which is a really simple, straightforward bill, which calls for the addition of 2 permanent classified positions to the Office of Racial Equity. And that will provide a team effort where there'll be a professional for collecting and processing the data. So we'll have some expertise in that area, and also a position that will conduct outreach and education. So as that office interacts with all of the agencies and departments throughout the state, it will now have the team in order to deliver the work. So that's a real exciting, I think, step forward. We're grateful for the office, but it has to be highly functioning. And the last time I checked, Susanna Davis does not have a clone. So we need to make sure they have the resources to do the work.
It sounds like she needs more than one clone from what I
Yes, exactly.
Well, it's funny because Hal mentioning H96 reminded me that I introduced S96 on the Senate side. As folks may or may not know, and it confuses the best of us, we have parallel tracks of House bills and Senate bills, but they all have to make it through both bodies before the end of the session. S96 is reintroducing the state planning office. And I just talked to our new CPO in the state, our chief performance officer, and I said, we're about to essentially double our general fund budget this year with federal funds. And it's going to be one-time money where, it's one thing to just say, okay, well, everything has to be a one-time expenditure. But how do we do, you all have research and development wings. You have, ways of trying to evaluate your success and the metrics by which you judge, what worked and what didn't. We don't do a great job of that in government. And I think many of you are aware of that. And I don't want to add a new layer of government just to add a new layer, but we need to be a lot more strategic about how we deploy resources, where we identify the need, and how we evaluate our success. And, I personally don't see an existing entity in state government that can pull people together across agencies and silos to do that work, even though we know this moment calls on us to do big picture thinking. So Senate Government Operations is going to have a hearing on what kind of planning infrastructure and innovation infrastructure do we need across agencies. The same goes for, I don't want to get on my soapbox here about things outside of racial equity, but this is cross-cutting. I mean, we know that we have to collect better information on income, gender, age, race, and dependent status or family size to know, are we helping people? Who are we helping? Who's left behind? And so, in addition, we know one of the better uses of one-time money will probably be modernizing our aging infrastructure in the state. And it's a priority of the governors as well. Well, we need to be able to do that in a way that doesn't perpetuate the same harms or, leave out the same important questions that we haven't been asking before. So a lot of us, and, Representative Colston serves on House Government Operations too. These are questions both of our committees are asking. How does government actually operate? But specific to your question as well, I serve on the Government Accountability Committee now. And one of my main goals in serving on that committee was to get us to disaggregate data in a much better way. And we have to collect that data. And a good use of one-time money is to build the infrastructure to collect better data in the state. It's been long overdue. And, I'm excited that we might have the resources to do a better job now.
So I'm looking at the chat, and what we mostly have in the chat is people dropping in their resources, things that they know that they want to share with the group, and that's great. Not too many questions, so I encourage people to ask questions. There is a question at the very top, going back to the discussion about the Social Equity Caucus, about is there a report on the bills that are being introduced? You both mentioned 2 bills, H96. and S96. And I'm curious if there are other specific legislative bills that you wanted to draw the attention of the business community to as it relates to this issue.
I can jump in just to say, you know, as the co-chair of the Social Equity Caucus, Coach and I have been working particularly hard, Representative Coach Christie and I have been working particularly hard on trying to bring everyone along and send us your bills that are related to equity, help us prioritize, help us talk to leadership about those priorities. And a majority of those, you know, are moving along. I can also send that document. It's a public document from our caucus. And on there, folks would find two issues I think relate to this conversation, which is business and capital access. So just the ability to start your own business and become an entrepreneur, to have the technical assistance to engage in that process. That, you know, is a very big priority that I know is going through House Commerce right now. And I've heard others, you know, Hal and I both heard it this morning. Other legislators in the House are very excited about what's coming out of that committee. So I hope to be a good steward of that on the Senate side as well. You know, one of the other major conversations that may not land in exactly the right, the place where it was introduced is land and homeownership access. So, you know, there's a kind of much bigger effort to think about, you know, that really roots someone somewhere, is the ability to have a farm, to own land, you know, and steward it yourself. Homeownership is really critical, you know, to that as well. And we don't have, I don't think there's a specific bill moving, but the governor's office and the administration has committed to trying to set aside some of its housing rehabilitation money that's going to be deployed specifically for BIPOC new homeowners. And I know people might be saying, well, you know, I mean, hopefully not people necessarily listening in now, but still people might say, is that really a big deal? Is that a lot of people? We have one of the biggest home ownership disparities in the country. About 21% of Black Vermonters own their home and 71% of white Vermonters. And home ownership and vehicle ownership are one of the greatest stabilizers that we have in our society. So if we believe in capitalism and we believe in giving everyone a chance to root themselves and to be successful in our current society and economy, they need to be able to equitably access home ownership. And so, you know, I think it's a major priority, and I'm glad that the governor agrees.
And I would add, it's a critical one, because when you really parse the numbers, it's very depressing to see the racial wealth gap and how huge it's become. And it was a 2018 report from the Institute of Public Policy, and they showed for the average white household in our country, for every dollar of wealth that they have, compares to 2 cents for an African-American family on average. So it's a huge, huge disparity. And we have to roll up our sleeves and figure out how we're going to make amends, because that's a non-starter as we go forward. And by 2040, majority of our country will be people of color. And if we haven't addressed that, we have some serious, serious problems on our hand.
Well, and I think Representative Colston, it was an effort that you did for a committee that we jointly sat on, that I learned about some of that, how that was rooted in our history as well. So I would encourage folks who are looking to learn more. There are a lot of resources available out there about how some of our housing policies in history have led us to this gap that you're talking about now. And you know, as painful as it is to revisit that and learn that, it is the moment to do that. So if you're seeking that knowledge, and frankly, even if you aren't, you should be, I would encourage you to do that. We have some resources, but obviously there's a lot of information available to you. So all of a sudden the chat has become a little active with lots of questions, which I think is fabulous. We have a question here about, do either of you know of employers who are a good example of effective DEI programs? And I see that repeated here as well. Is there some way to that other businesses could learn from that? Questions that we're getting here at the Vermont Chamber are, we should be doing something in this area. Where do we start? Who should we talk to? Who can we hire to help us through that? So along that same line, I'm just curious if either of you had seen some businesses that are doing a particularly good job in this area.
I feel like I'm going to get off and be like, oh, that person is great. I mean, one I start with that comes to mind, and nobody's perfect, right? And it's just, we're not a monolithic community. So it can be really different, depending on who you are. But I've really appreciated Rhino Foods and the kind of attention to different pathways for different people, and using metrics, but also checking in on the stories, also checking in on the overall climate. Thinking about shared spaces, which I know is challenging right now in the pandemic, but, a shared culture that isn't just inviting people to something that's already made, but lets a lot of employees offer input about changes that they'd like to see, and then them seeing those put into motion. So I certainly don't work there. This isn't a commercial for Rhino Foods, but, I think it's that it's not necessarily just, oh, they've like found the right language to put into policy. That's never really the thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's, a really evolving culture, a leader who knows that racial justice is a big part of their leadership. So you can read my other op-ed about the city of Burlington and how much it sets us back when we question someone's neutrality or otherwise question their leadership because they are advancing racial justice, not celebrate them for advancing racial justice. And often, when a white male is advancing racial justice, people think, wow, that's amazing. What a selfless person, And when it's a BIPOC Vermonter, it's seen as, self-serving or somehow not neutral. And, often that is why I would say we're losing people of color to those fields. I talk to a lot of young people, and young people of color in Vermont say, well, I want any kind of job except when I have to talk about equity, because I'm really exhausted by white people. I'm just saying it. I'm just saying it on the recording, So I am hearing that from young Vermonters of color. And I know Kathleen and others said, what about the young people? They are like, I'm not safe at work if I talk about this stuff. So I need a job doing anything else. And so, you have to pay a lot of attention to when you prioritize this in the workplace. That's not a safe time for people of color. It's a very scary time, because they're going to start to tell their truth, and they don't know who's going to be offended by that and what risk it's going to have to them. So doing the DEI stuff isn't, the end all be all. It's the beginning of a journey where if you as a leader aren't reprioritizing constantly the needs of people of color over the hurt feelings of white people, you will fail and you'll lose all your people of color in the process.
And I just want to add to that. I think it comes down to leadership to some degree. And I'm encouraged that some large institutions in our community are beginning to look at their hiring process, which is fraught with implicit bias, and how some of these organizations have taken on a process where they're self-critiquing their process as they're going through the process. So you're learning about the blind spots, and you're learning how to unpack whatever it is that allows you to react to someone that basically looks like you, if you're a person of the dominant culture. So challenging those processes to be more open and honest, and really a learning experience, allows you to make different decisions about who you're going to bring into your organization. So I would start looking at that process, and to understand how do you need to grow to make it such that you're truly hiring people based on their competencies and their experiences and their ability to contribute to your organization while they may be different. And how does your space shift its culture, as Senator Rahm said, so that we don't continue having these conversations.
So a couple of questions here about recruiting? How do we recruit more students from the BIPOC population? How do we recruit? What role can local businesses play in creating and fostering a welcoming and inclusive communities? And I will say that you see me learning on the fly here as I start to take my brain a little bit from how do we recruit more people, to listening to both of you and saying, oh gosh, maybe recruiting is not the problem. How do we welcome them? And so I think some of these questions here there's also a lot of well-meaning Vermonters who wish for more students of color, who wish for more people of color. But, I know in all aspects of my life, wishing is not doing. And so I think I'm thinking about this and these questions and curious if you want to help answer those questions around what can local businesses do? What can colleges do to retain these folks?
Yeah, I mean, so Hal and I for decades now have been on the same boards and commissions, like part of the same, conversations. And so I would just start by saying, to be really honest, people ask us all the time, is this a safe organization for me to get involved in? Should I apply to this job? We do that because there's a lot of safety involved and there's a lot of time and energy and heartache. If you really put as you all know, if you hire someone and they commit, you want that to be somewhat long lasting because it's painful when someone leaves and it's not a good situation. So definitely, I can tell you people of color are looking for other people of color in that organization and to see if they're well rested and they look supported and they don't look like they're at the bottom of the website somewhere, so that's a good place to start. But, absolutely, we talk to each other. I have told UVM and all of our higher ed institutions too, your grad programs, you have a bad year, you're never going to get another person of color from California for the next 10 years. Because if they're going to move all the way across the country, they need to know that they're making the right decision and that they'll be supported and they know each other somehow. It's a big state, but I'm telling you, so many niche programs and businesses here have gotten great results from having good word of mouth. So, frankly, that's a lot of what I've said when Virgins or Rutland or Burlington or any of these communities have a major setback that's public, that people look and say, okay, Vermont had that money to help people move to the state, but I am not moving there because you can help someone buy a house, but if there's a Confederate flag across the street, they're not moving there, so that's our issue right now is people need to feel like they're going to be safe and their neighbors are going to protect them just like we say is the Vermont way. But if that doesn't happen for people of color, they're not going to believe you.
I think we see that expressed in the chat by Patrick Leduc, who says, that he has talked with BIPOC individuals who have expressed how hard it is to find a work environment that they feel like they belong to. So that sense of belonging, how can that happen in a workplace? I think Representative Colston, that brings us back to your beginning comments about, 75%, I believe you said, of white people do not have a friend, someone that they call a friend that is Black, a person of color, Indigenous. So as far as creating that environment, Patrick is asking specifically about work, but I would, in any way, can you help us understand that?
Well, I think, money talks. And if this is something that's really important, then as a business, you got to make the investment. UVM Medical Center a few years ago went at this, with full throttle to get it to a place where it could become part of their infrastructure. And they started out with a steering committee that I was able to participate on. We finally got to the place where we knew we needed to hire someone who's going to oversee the diversity, equity, and inclusive efforts. So they made that investment. You got to have a plan, and you just can't wake up one morning and say, we need more Black and brown people, and you just run out there and usually causing harm because you're not ready as an organization to be supportive and welcoming. So why don't you work on that as you can and begin to make those investments? And I think that's when the culture begins to shift. And Black and brown people know when an organization is here for my interest.
Mhm.
So Hava Walther asks questions, sort of says that businesses and nonprofits are asking the wrong question. How do we help diverse populations rise through the ranks and become leaders? And that maybe we should be all asking, not how do we get BIPOC leaders in business to look like historic models, but how do we recognize the new model? And wondering if either of you can think about that in the leadership model sense.
Well, I've always appreciated just any little anecdote I hear about how other cultures view leadership and treat leadership. And, ours is a very Eurocentric notion of the leader is like higher than everybody else. They're at the top of the pyramid. They're on some throne or some platform, above everybody else. And in many cultures, the leader is below everyone else. They are in service to everyone else. They are situated in a way that puts everyone else first. And so we've had this come up a lot when we've looked at leaders for major institutions in Vermont who, quote unquote, looks like a leader, talks like a leader, acts like a leader. If we don't unpack where our notion comes from of who's a leader and get past the how many CEOs are 6 feet tall and named John, then we never get to the point where we view people as other leaders, not because of their proximity to the tall white Johns of the world, but in their actual power themselves and in what they bring. That's not a deficit. And I think that so much has to do with why it's important for young people to see role models of color, to see people that look like them in positions of power. Because if I say to someone, you can do what I'm doing, it sounds immediately different. Like I'm telling them, you have an asset and a gift that other people might not have, rather than a white person saying to, a Black child, hey, you can succeed. It's the implicit message there is in spite of who you are, not because of who you are. And I know that most people don't think that's what they're communicating, but sometimes it can't be helped. And I sometimes forget that. And then someone will come up to me and say, you're the first Asian American person I've ever seen in a leadership role. You're the first brown person I've ever seen in a leadership role. That makes a huge difference, more than I realize on a daily basis. But people can't fit their entire lived experience into a 3-minute hearing, or testifying for 3 minutes, or sharing their lunch hour with their boss. They need sometimes someone who just gets their lived experience. So the more that you hire and support people in high leadership levels who you're constantly in touch with, it goes back to what Hal said. People have to see those relationships already exist. So when a Black woman comes to the state and says, do you know where I should get my hair done? They're not automatically asking you to pull up like a laminated copy of places to go get their hair done, as much as they're asking, do you know what it's like to be me? Right. And so hair became such a big thing for people in the pandemic. I'm Indian, so we just kind of put some mustard oil in and keep it moving, but for white people too, they were like, what's going on? I can't go get my hair done. My life is falling apart. Black women face that all the time. They have people travel up from Massachusetts to do their hair. Or, when the borders close with Canada, that takes a lot of things for immigrants and other people of color we can't get. We rely on Canada. So, if people don't realize how much of our lives we have to spend doing extra things that white people don't have to do in Vermont, they won't appreciate what they're asking people to do by moving here.
There's so much here. Let's continue this for a couple more hours, please. I can't do that, but there's 2 last questions here, and I wish they weren't as important as they are, but they're kind of important. So Stephanie Clark asks, well, I don't think that means that you two and other people of color have to constantly be educating white people on what we should do. We should be able to do that on our own. It's really appreciated. There's been several people in this that are saying thank you for your time today. And then calling me out specifically, because these are legislators, I expect that the chamber cannot compensate them for their time here, but could the chamber make a donation in their names to an organization they value to thank them for for this business education today. So that's something that we can take up later, getting back to sort of the first point and how we all need to sort of do our part. If we're asking for learning, we should be able and willing to pay for that. And then Witchy R2 also says, I'm a BIPOC person who does anti-racism work at the Brattleboro Memorial Hospital and helped found a council on racial equity. Is there a network of other BIPOC who do this work in their businesses where we can help discuss wins and lean on when we need support? And just seeing that, I see that as being something that a chamber does, whether that's my chamber or some other organization. We aggregate people in concepts around that. So do you know of a group like that in that workplace setting?
Yeah, so there are a couple. First, I want to say, I appreciate Stephanie's what she put in there, a calling in instead of a calling out, I would say. But that gives me an opportunity to sort of end with a story that is really meaningful for me, which is having a really long and wonderful relationship with Tom Levitt at Northfield Savings Bank, and knowing the journey that he's been on, and knowing that we have Yael Friedman, who is amazing, leading the Northfield Savings Bank Foundation Board. And in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, I think what I know happened from Yael's perspective is that the organization said, we should put some money into equity, DEI work, and blah, blah, blah. And she said, I will not let us give this money to other white people to stare at themselves. We are giving this money to organizations led by people of color to do this work in whatever way they see fit. And she had some conversations with different organizations. They gave money to different organizations. One with the NAACP became a new effort called the Bright Leadership Institute that I'm now helping to establish and advance, which will train and support BIPOC Vermonters to run for office and to take other leadership roles. So it has a communications component, and most importantly, it has a network built in. And we're calling it the Bright Leadership Institute after Luvenia Dorsey Bright, who was the first Black woman to serve in the legislature in the 90s from South Burlington. And what I really like to say is that when the Northfield Savings Bank and the foundation started this journey of giving away a humongous sum of money, $100,000 to an organization that was forming, they could have never known that it would lead to me being able to call Bill Bright, Luvenia's son, and say, we're naming an organization after her. And, they, like someone said in the chat, if we hold these things too tightly and we try to control the outcomes and control the model, we'll never let really amazing and creative things happen. And so, just really appreciating that. I think Northfield Savings Bank Foundation helped set the moral compass for how we should really be doing this work in the state. And Witchy, I have other ideas. There's a lot of Facebook groups, and then we try to catch each other when we can. But yes, appreciating that you're more isolated in Southern Vermont.
Great. Please send me an email if you have other resources. We'll capture everything in the chat. If we will make sure that all the reports that have been referenced are put there, the different groups, we'll make sure so that everybody here, but also people who didn't come today can also access that. So please feel free to do that. I would be remiss, Representative Colston, if I didn't ask you, is there something, a success similar that you might want to call in and mention before we leave the call?
Well, I just want to share how important it is to do this work in community. And I would strongly encourage those of you who identify as white, who are in leadership roles, who have power to make some change happen, don't do it alone. Reach out to your other colleagues. Years ago, I saw Peggy McIntosh talk about her work of unpacking the invisible knapsack of white privilege. She was at Middlebury College. Packed, lecture hall, mainly people of color. And I said to her in the Q&A, here we are in the second whitest state in the country, and I look around this room, I see very few white people. Why is that? And she was very blunt. Says, we struggle with knowing how to be in community. So reach out to your colleagues who are going down this path, and how do you come together and form your own community to do this work? You can't do it alone.
Thank you. Thank you both for your time. I really appreciate this. Let's make this not the first and last conversation that we have. I think the Vermont Chamber as an organization is trying to figure out how to enter this conversation in a meaningful way, how we can support businesses in a meaningful way. But we're also thinking about doing that with all the chambers across the state. We're having conversations with, there's about 30 chambers across the state, and that network of folks are saying, okay, we've all got to figure this out. So working in that small community, doing that as well. I appreciate both of your time. For those of you who are on the call, remember next Monday at 3 p.m. we will be doing the virtual policy series again. We will be joined by Housing and Community Development Commissioner Josh Hanford and Director of Community Planning at the Department of Housing and Community Development, Chris Cochran. We'll discuss problems and solutions impacting housing in Vermont, including the influence of Act 250 on the housing market. And after today's discussion, I imagine we'll be bringing in some of the historical concepts of housing and how we might need to address some of that in the racial diversity, equity, and inclusion area as well. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.